Chapter 3 of the Persian Pickle Club by Sandra Dallas. I'd come to be Rita's friend. Of course, I couldn't say anything so silly to her. I told Rita I was there to get to know her better. It took me longer to come calling than I'd planned, what with the Massies moving in, and after that, me having to put up tomatoes and the dry peaches. Bottled tomatoes I like, but dried peaches are a waste of good time since there's nothing that tastes worse than dried peach pie unless it's a rail fence. Grover likes them, however, but then Grover likes anything. "That's nice of you, dearie," Mrs. Ritter said. "You girls go sit out where it's cool." Mrs. Ritter smelled like the blackberry jam that was cooking on the stove. Rita smelled like a hired hand. Her bangs were plastered to her forehead, and sweat rings stained her dress under her arms. There were blackberry stains on her apron, which was really one of Mrs. Ritter's and was big enough to go around Rita 3 or 4 times. Agnes T. Ritter started to take off her apron too, but Mrs. Ritter spoke up. "Agnes, would you help with these dishes while we wait for the berries to cook?" Agnes T. Ritter sighed and retied her apron. She filled the tea kettle from the pump on the sink and put it on the cook stove. "Don't spill the dishwater on the floor. Nettie says if you do that, you'll marry a drunk," I told her. I guess it served me right for being mean, because Agnes T. Ritter said right back, "I hear you set up a squatter village on your place." "Agnes," Mrs. Ritter said, "it's not our business." "It is if we all get head lice," she muttered. I itched my head for fun and turned to Rita. "Let's go sit under the trumpet vine and scratch chiggers." I could see the red welt on Rita's arms and knew she hadn't waited for my invitation. She'd probably gotten them in the blackberry patch. We walked across the yard where Mrs. Ritter's hollyhocks and morning glories were in full bloom despite the heat that wilted man, beast, and even Grover, and sat down on a wooden bench. It was as cool a place as you could find, being in the shade of the sod house that Tom's grandfather had built when he moved onto the land way back in the 1870s. Now the old place was a tool shed, but it was still pretty because somebody had planted trumpet vines to hide the sod, and those orange flowers covered the house and hung down over us, blocking out the sun. Rita wiggled back on the bench, then stood up fast and said, "Oh, hell, if it's not the chiggers, it's splinters." She pulled a half-inch sliver out of the back of her leg and sat down again carefully and fanned her face with her hand. "I don't know what's worse, the cook stove or the heat out here." "Were you helping with the jam?" I asked. "No, I was just heating water to rinse the dinner dishes. Agnes says we have to pour boiling water over everything. I forgot to do that yesterday, and she washed the dishes all over again after I dried them and even put them away. Agnes sure knows her onions about dirt. All she does is criticize, criticize, criticize. I wish she'd stop telling people about how I didn't know the difference between salt and sugar. She brought that up 10 times, and even if it had happened to someone else, I wouldn't have thought it was funny. Why, a person who cooks every day would get them mixed up." Rita pulled a trumpet flower off the vine and put the end in her mouth and sucked out the sweetness. "What happened?" Rita threw away the blossom and picked another. "I made a cake, only I used a cup of salt and a pinch of sugar instead of the other way around." "Anybody could do that," I said, even though it seemed pretty peculiar to me. "Shoot, I bet even Agnes T. Ritter could get them mixed up." "Why do you call her that?" Rita asked me, pretending the flower was a little horn and blowing through it. "Why do you always call her Agnes T. Ritter instead of just Agnes?" The question made me blink. She'd been Agnes T. Ritter all her life, and I'd forgotten why, so I had to stop a minute to remember. We started calling her that when we were kids. You know that baby rhyme, "Jack be nimble, Jack be quick." Well, one day Floyd said, "Agnes T. Ritter, Agnes T. Quick," and Agnes T. Ritter got so mad that it just naturally stuck. I can tell she doesn't like it. She frowned every time you called her that at the club meeting. She frowns a lot. Rita seemed pleased about that. She peered through the end of the trumpet flower as if it were a spyglass. How come you're called Queenie Bean? Because that's my name. Oh, Rita scratched the back of her neck and I could see a little red chigger bump. Try not to scratch. It's better if you don't, I told her. Sometimes a little butter and salt mixed together help. Rita made a face. You don't eat it, I said quickly. You rub it on the welt. I didn't tell her Grover used tobacco spit. Rita stretched back, leaning her head against the dry wire grass of the soddy behind her, and when I realized she was pregnant. Seeing me look at her stomach, she said, 6 months. It seems like ages. I started counting backwards, and Rita knew right off what I was doing. December. We were married the end of December. I got pregnant the first month, she said. Oh, don't be embarrassed. Everybody counts. Agnes even counted out loud. Well, I'm sorry, I said. Me too. I didn't want a baby right off. Oh, I didn't mean that. I mean the counting. I think you're so lucky to have a baby. You can have it, Rita said. I must have looked shocked because she added, Queenie, it was a joke. She didn't sound it like it was a joke, however. Rita was quiet for a minute. A hummingbird stopped in midair and stuck its beak down the throat of an orange trumpet, then flew off. I like the green hummingbirds best. The red ones are mean, I said, changing the subject. It wasn't polite for me to talk about the baby if Rita didn't want to. But she changed it right back. I shouldn't have said that. I mean, it's nice to have a baby, only with things the way they are, it's not a very good time. Sometimes I get awfully down in the dumps. Agnes said getting pregnant is all my fault. Maybe she doesn't know it takes two to tango. Agnes T. Ritter is sour cherries, I said indignantly. Agnes is bad cheese, Rita giggled. Agnes T. Ritter is stepping into fresh cow pie in your bare feet. Are cow pies what I think they are? Rita asked, and I nodded, and she laughed so hard she bent over double and then sat up straight as if she'd picked up another splinter. You all right? I asked. Rita put her hand into her pocket and pulled out a needle. I forgot this was here, she said. She took out a wadded up quilt square and held it up for me to see. It's bum, isn't it? It was. You'll learn. My first one was worse than that, I told her, although that wasn't true. I worked so hard on my first piece of patchwork that it had turned out to be almost perfect. But I wanted us to have more in common than being short and not liking Agnes T. Ritter, which was nothing special. Everybody didn't like Agnes T. Ritter. Then I reminded myself Agnes T. Ritter was a member of the Persian Pickle Club, so I had to like her and be her friend. I don't seem to get the hang of it, Rita said. I keep pricking my fingers. Put rubbing alcohol on them. It'll toughen them up. Rita ironed the patches with her hand, then put the thread hanging down from the back of the patch through the needle. The thread was dirty. The needle's as sticky as that awful flypaper Mom hangs in the kitchen. Well, I'd say it's spinach, and to hell with it, Rita said, wadding up the patchwork and throwing it between us on the bench. Instead of letting Rita know I was too dumb to get what she had said about spinach, I picked up the quilting and said, There's nobody who can sew in this weather except Ella Crook. She's a funny one. I can't exactly figure her out. She looks like she'd fall down if you blew on her, but she walked all the way up here for a visit in the awful sun yesterday and didn't even work up a sweat. She hardly said 2 words when she got here, just handed Tom a plate of fudge and muttered something about remembering how much he liked it. I thought she didn't like me, but Tom says she's as shy as anybody he'd ever met. Is that so? Yes, even when you get to know her, she doesn't say much. How come she takes in sewing? She couldn't make much money in it. What with everybody in such a pickle about money just now, who can afford to send out sewing? She's alone, kind of a widow. She has to make do. We all help her out a little when we can. Does she live with that busybody? Mrs. Judd? No, but Mrs. Judd looks out for her. We all do. I pressed my finger on the main seam of Rita's sewing so that it lay flat. It helps if you iron the seams open before you start the next row, I said, changing the subject. Do you have a thimble? I can't use one, Rita said, and I could tell I had my work cut out for me in making Rita a quilter. What do you mean, kind of a widow? Where's her husband? Rita asked. Whose? Ella Crook's. With Ben Crook, it was best to let sleeping dogs lie, as Nettie put it. I wanted to change the subject again, but Rita was looking at me with such curiosity, I knew she wouldn't let me. Nobody knows, I said. If you don't use a thimble, you'll poke a hole in your finger. You mean she's a grass widow? Rita reached into her pocket and pulled out a thimble, putting it onto her middle finger. This one, I said, taking the thimble from her and putting it on the correct finger. What's a grass widow? That's when a woman's married but her husband ditched her or something. Is that what happened? I shrugged. I personally think it was hard times. Ben Crook thought the sun rose and set on Ella. He was the best husband in the world, but he lit out a year ago and nobody's seen or heard from him since. I do try not to think about it. Farming isn't easy for men these days. I think it's worse for the women, Rita said. I hate housework. The only time I ever agreed with Agnes was when she said we ought to wear wrinkled clothes and not waste our time with those flat irons. Rita looked down at her quilt square. This time goes slow. It's enough to put me into a blue funk. I'd never heard of a blue funk before, but I had an idea what it meant. Why don't you turn it into a baby quilt? It won't take any time at all. Why, that's a swell idea. You're a true friend, Queenie. She looked up as the screen door banged and Mrs. Ritter came out with a pitcher and 2 glasses. There's the true friend, I told Rita. Then I called Mrs. Ritter, I think I'd sell my soul for a glass of lemonade. Mrs. Ritter tried to frown, but it didn't work because she was such a jolly woman. My stars, don't let Dad hear you blaspheme, dearie, and call me Sabra. You know we always use first name for members of the Persian Pickle Club. Not for Mrs. Judd. I think God would strike me dead if I called her Septima, I said, and Mrs. Ritter laughed. She looked down at Rita's little mess of sewing. Don't you think she's getting the hang of it, Queenie? It's nice, isn't it? Then she turned and went back to the house. This is real tasty, I called, then told Rita. She cares a lot about you. Lemons must cost 10 cents each. I'd trade lemonade any day for a real drink. Bourbon, yum, Rita said, adding, tell me about those women at your club. At our club, I corrected her, because whether she knew it or not, she was a member too. There wasn't much to tell about us because we were all pretty ordinary. Mrs. Judd was the richest, which anybody could tell from the Packard, even though it was old. The Judds owned the biggest farm in Wabanus County, and Prosper Judd was the president of the bank in Ethridge. Mrs. Judd had inherited it from her people. But rich didn't always mean lucky. Their only child, Wilson, who was a few years ahead of me in school, caught infantile paralysis, and the members of the Persian Pickle Club had exercised his legs every day for a year so that he could walk again. Then he walked right out of Harveyville and never once wrote to his mother. Ada June was every bit as nice as she was the day Ada June was every bit as nice as she was the day she was the hostess for Persian Pickle. I told Rita. Buck raised horses, but people weren't buying horses anymore, and since the Zens had more kids than nickels in their pockets, they were hard up. Still, it didn't bother them much, and they were as happy a couple as I ever saw. I liked Ada June a lot, but she was almost 40. Opalina Ducks was the one with white hair so long she could sit on it, I explained. You could always tell where she'd been by the trail of hairpins. Sometimes she was as crazy as the crazy quilt she worked on, carrying on conversations with her chickens. There was no harm in that, however, most of us talked to chickens at one time or another. But Opalina brought them inside the house so she could talk to them while she did her work. Nettie Burgett had a goiter, so she always wore a scarf around her neck, which made her look like her husband, Tyrone, who didn't have a neck at all. Tyrone ran a numbers game at the billiard hall over in Blue Hill, leaving Nettie and Velma, who was the only Burgett kid still at home, to do most of the farming. He'd turned to gambling after the government got rid of prohibition and his bootleg business went to heck. Of course, being on the wrong side of the law didn't keep him from being almost as righteous as Foster Olive. We all knew he was a trial to Nettie. Although she never complained, we also knew he was years behind in his mortgage payments, and the Eckridge Bank would have foreclosed if Mrs. Judd hadn't told Prosper to let it ride for Nettie's sake. Nettie's daughter Velma never came to Pickle, so I skipped her. I told Rita that Forrest Ann was Tyrone's sister, but you wouldn't know it because she was so much nicer than he was. In fact, Forrest Ann kind of made up for Tyrone being such a dope. She and Nettie were more like sisters than sisters-in-law. When Nettie turned 50, Tyrone didn't give her so much as a pin, but Forrest Ann drove her into Topeka to see Captain Blood at the picture show and have lunch at F.W. Woolworth's, where they drank knee-highs and ate weenies that were cooked on hot rollers in a glass case. Nettie said it was the best birthday she ever had. Forrest Ann was a widow woman because of the untimely death of her husband, Everett Finding, who was dumb enough to drown in a glass of water. He was sitting on top of a reaper one day, reading a girly magazine, when something spooked the horses, and Everett toppled over into the machinery. The horses ran away, dragging Everett and leaving pieces of him all over the field. Being fertilized by Everett the next year's crop was the best that farm ever harvested. Forrest Ann's kids had all grown up and moved away by the time Everett died, and she was spending the evenings by herself. Nearly killed her. Sewing kept her from going crazy. She says a woman without a needle is like a man without a plow. I didn't explain to Rita that Dr. Sipes was the real reason Forrest Ann kept her sanity, because he stopped at the Finding house every night for a glass of buttermilk. Or maybe Dr. Sipes drank the bootleg that Everett had received in payment for helping Tyrone with his steal. Forrest Ann had as many jars of hooch as tomatoes in her root cellar. A woman without a needle is like a man without a needle, Rita said, and I laughed even though I didn't get it. Who is that real old lady? She asked. Sarah's Root. She came here from Ohio when she was a bride, marrying Cheed Root after she had known him for only 2 weeks. She was about to get hitched to a fellow her parents picked out, even though she didn't think much of him because he'd gotten off his horse when he proposed. He hadn't gotten off his horse when he proposed. Then Cheed came along, and they ran off to Kansas and have been sweethearts all their lives, just sweethearts. Quilting helped her too when she lived in a dugout and had no neighbors the first year. All she had was her quilting, and she went to sewing during the day instead of housework. Once she looked under her bed and found grass growing 8 inches high. Cheed was so happy she'd married him that he'd do anything for her. When he went to town one day, she asked him to bring her back a piece of fabric that she had admired. Instead of a length, he brought her the whole bolt of cloth. It was Persian pickle, what some call paisley. Sarah still has a few yards of it left because it's so precious to her. She's particular about what she uses it for or who gets the scraps. Of course, we all have pieces of it in our quilts. That's how come we're called the Persian Pickle Club. Now I've told you about all of us except Agnes T. Ritter and Mrs. Ritter, and you know them already. Of course, there's Ruby. She'd still be a member if she came back to Harveyville. Ruby and Floyd lost their farm last year when the bank in Topeka took it over, so they piled everything into their Chevrolet truck and went to California. I stopped a minute, remembered my last look at Ruby and Floyd waving from the truck with the kids in the back playing on a mattress. The Persian Pickle had gone over to see them pull out, and I cried and cried until Mrs. Judd said, "Hush up, Queenie Bee. Don't make Ruby feel worse than she does already. They've got no choice. In times like these, it's root hog or die." Ruby was my best friend, but I haven't heard from her yet. Nobody has. Grover said they're too busy eating oranges. I knew Grover missed Floyd as much as I missed Ruby, but that was partly because he'd co-signed a loan on a tractor for him, and when they left, we'd had to pay it off ourselves. "Don't you mind that all those women are so old?" Rita asked. She was right about them being old. Everybody in Harveyville seemed to be old nowadays, because all the young people had gone off to look for jobs. "That's why I'm glad you came. We're the same age, 23. Of course, Agnes T. Ritter is only 25, but she acts like she's 30, 40 even." "I think she was born old and cranky," Rita said. I nodded at that, then took off Rita's thimble, which I still had on. It made a sucking sound as it came loose from my sweaty finger. I don't care how old the Persian Pickles are, because they're my friends. When my mama died, they saw me through it. The Pickles are family. Rita clucked her tongue to show she was sorry about my mother. "Do you have a father?" "I'm an orphan now, same as Grover," I said. I told Rita about Grover and me, how my father passed when I was in high school, and Mama just wasted away from grief. Grover's mother was a member of the Persian Pickle, just like mine, but I never knew her. She died when Grover was born, and his dad raised Grover and David, who is Grover's big brother. He lives in Oregon now. After we were married, Grover and I lived with Dad Bean until he died 2 years ago. David inherited half of the farm, but he said he'd never be a farmer like Grover, and he sold us his half cheap. The Beans are real nice people. I started to tell her how Dad Bean had brought me that bunch of meadow flowers stuck in a milk jug when I lost the baby. But it wasn't right to tell a pregnant woman about a baby dying, so I put the thimble back on and finished Rita's quilt square in silence. When I was done, I smoothed the seams with my fingers and turned it over. "Now, this looks just fine. The Persian Pickle will quilt it for you after you make the rest of the patches. You can do it of an evening when you're listening to the Bob Hope Show or Fibber McGee and Molly." "I read," Rita said. I thought about that for a minute. Reading's all right, I suppose, but with quilting, when you're done, you have a quilt. When you finish with the book, you don't have anything. Rita looked at me kind of funny, as if she hadn't taken in the wisdom of what I'd said. Then I thought she had something else on her mind and was deciding whether to tell me about it. "I read all the time because I want to be a writer," she said at last. "I've applied for a job at the Topeka Enterprise, and I'll write stories about Harveyville. They want somebody they can call in case we have a bank robbery or something here. It's called a correspondent." "Harveyville doesn't have a bank," I said. When Rita frowned, I added quickly, "Still, I think that's wonderful." I looked down at her stomach. "But how can you be a newspaper writer when you're going to have a baby?" "Somebody else will just have to look after it. I can't miss my chance." I wanted to tell her that if I had a baby, I wouldn't trade it for all the newspapers in the world, but it wasn't my place to do so. "Here comes trouble," Rita said, looking up at Agnes T. Ritter, who had just opened the screen door. She started toward us with Tom behind her. The two of them were almost the same height, but Tom had inherited all of the good looks. "It appears you drank all the lemonade," Agnes T. Ritter said, scowling at Rita. "So much sugar's not good for someone in your condition," she added, as if Rita had a disease. "At least Mom doesn't get the sugar mixed up with the salt like some people." Tom rolled his eyes at me, and I figured Agnes T. Ritter would throw that salt and sugar mix up at Rita for the rest of her life. Rita grinned at Tom and said, "Hi, Ace." Then she winked at me and looked over at Agnes T. Ritter and added, "Hi to you too, Agnes T. Ritter." Before I left, I invited Tom and Rita for supper the next evening. That didn't give me much time to dust and hoover the house and put on out my best quilts and cook the supper, but with Agnes T. Ritter picking on Rita the way she had, I'd gotten an idea. At noon, after I told Grover about our guest, he told me to serve pickles, pig's feet, and sauerkraut, which was his favorite as well as Tom's, but I wouldn't do it. After all, Rita was from Denver and ate in restaurants where the food was cooked by Mexicans and Chinamen. Grover suggested fried chicken, but I told him Mrs. Ritter fixed it better than I did, so he said to make up my own mind, and finally I decided on ham and red-eye gravy. Grover approved. There's nothing better than red-eye gravy and mashed potatoes, he said. Put plenty of bourbon in the gravy so Tom can drink it. You know how Howard Ritter is. Tom told me his dad's farm is the driest place in Kansas, and he wasn't talking about the weather. Why don't you make a pie for dessert? I knew Grover would ask for that. Okay, how about rhubarb? It was Grover's favorite. Rhubarb's a little past its prime, isn't it? I found some late stalks that haven't gone stringy yet, I said, hoping Grover wouldn't ask me where. He didn't. I got chores to do before the old dog barks, he said, leaving me in the kitchen as he headed out to the barn. That was just the way I wanted it. Men didn't understand how much work there was in a supper invitation. It took me all the rest of the afternoon to do the cooking and set the table. There wasn't a minute to spare. In fact, I barely finished in time to go stand in the screened-in porch with Grover to watch Tom and Rita walk down the road, stirring up the yellow dirt that was as dry as ashes. It rose waist high and stayed there, so you could see only the top half of them. The wind was blowing too, not hard, just enough to get that darn dust all over my clean house. I ran back inside to close the windows, but they were already shut with towels shoved into the cracks. Even so, little lines of dirt were forming near the openings. Rita and Tom weren't in any hurry and fooled around as they walked along. Every now and then Rita bumped into Tom on purpose and they laughed. Watching them reminded me of Grover and me when we were first married and liked to walk around the fields at dusk, kicking at the clods of dirt and jumping over the ruts that the rain had cut into the road. Tom went off into our east field and picked up a handful of dirt and held it to his nose, then stood up and let it sift out of his fingers. It was powdery, like the dirt on the road. I saw him shake his head and frown and say something to Rita, but by the time they reached us, they were laughing and holding hands again, and so were Grover and I. Rita hugged me and Tom kissed my cheek, and that was the start of just about the best evening we ever had. Tom and Rita said so too. Boy, were they glad to get away from Agnes T. Ritter. I don't care if you burn dinner, Queenie, just don't give me anything white, Tom said. If Agnes isn't serving creamed onions or cottage cheese, it's rice or chicken boiled so long that there isn't any taste left, and custard for dessert. I never knew there was so much colorless food a person could eat. Since she's so crazy about eating white stuff, I told her to serve popcorn the next time she and Mom had club meeting, Rita said. Buttered popcorn. I didn't understand. You can't quilt and eat buttered popcorn. That's the idea, silly. Tom sat down on the arm of the Davenport, putting his arm around Rita, who stood next to him. What's that you're drinking, Grover? Popsicles, Grover said. Darn good stuff, too. It's Tyrone's leftover bourbon, which is better than what you buy legal these days. Sometimes I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt was wrong about putting an end to Prohibition. Tangle leg suits me. How about you, Morning Glory? Tom put his arm around Rita, who wore a pretty yellow sundress, a yellow silk ribbon around her hair, and a tiny gold wristwatch on her arm. Is that stuff really bourbon? She asked. It's awfully strong, I warned her. Well, hot dog then. The bigger the kick, the better, she said. I'll go see to dinner, I told the men after Grover brought the drinks, expecting Rita to follow me into the kitchen the way women did. Instead, she went out on the porch and sat down with Tom and Grover. I made the gravy and put dinner on the table, hurrying so I wouldn't miss anything. When I was finished, I called everybody to come in. Tom and Grover said things looked good enough to eat, but Rita forgot to say, "My, you shouldn't have gone to all this trouble the way you're supposed to. I guess they have different manners in the city." Tom applied for a job with the copper mining company in Butte, Montana, Grover said, after he returned thanks, being especially grateful for friends and asking the Lord for rain. Me and about 1,000 other men, there's not much call for engineering graduates these days. I guess Rita will be a famous newspaper reporter before I even get the notice that I've been turned down. Tom took an extra big helping of mashed potatoes. I kind of look forward to coming back to Harveyville, but I'd forgotten how damn hard farming is. Toots over here Toots over there's been game, but she wasn't brought up to slop pigs. This life is even harder on her than it is me. Neither Grover nor I could think of anything to say. We knew farming was hard, but it was the best life we could think of. We were silent until Tom said, "Queenie, this is the finest gravy I ever tasted." I nodded to accept the compliments. Then I said to Grover, "Maybe you didn't know Rita's going to write articles for the Enterprise? You writing up Stitch and Cackle?" I kicked Grover under the table. "For your information, it's called the Persian Pickle Club." Grover and Tom broke out laughing anyway. Rita chuckled too, even though I had to smile because Stitch and Cackle really did describe Persian pickle sometimes. Rita cut her ham into little pieces before she answered Grover. "I'm going to write about the school board election." She put a piece of ham into her mouth and chewed it. "Tom's dad says the way people vote in it will tell whether good times are coming back. The new people running for the school board want to build a grade school, and that'll make taxes go up. So if they win, I'll say people believe good times are around the corner and they don't mind paying more to the government. But if the old school board members are re-elected, it means voters think hard times are here to stay and they want to keep taxes low. That's called a slant." "You see those better times, Tom?" Grover asked. "Maybe," Tom said slowly, using his spoon instead of his knife on the butter. "If it had been as hard as ice when I'd put it on the table, but the heat in the room had melted it, and Tom could have scooped it up with his slice of bread. Not personally, I haven't. I guess I can't complain since we've got a roof over our heads and something to eat. It could be a lot worse. I guess I could be one of my creditors." "Yeah, things are so tight here they ought to call this place Hardyville." I noticed that Grover's napkin was still folded on the table. We never used napkins except for company. "Had any luck finding work here, Tom?" "You bet. I made all of 50 cents this summer." He chuckled, but the rest of us didn't. "Edgar Halbert hired me to do a day's plowing for $1, but I finished in half a day, so all I got was 50 cents. If Rita sells this article of hers, she'll make 20 times what I did, and she won't have blisters either." "You spend the 50 cents in one place?" Grover asked, which was so funny that we all burst out laughing. "I thought about taking it over to that place at Blue Hill and putting down a bet with Tyrone Burgett. Easy come, easy go, but it's too far to walk, so I guess I'll buy a farm with the money instead." "It's not fair," Grover said, getting serious again. "Work like a nigger, and what do you have?" He looked at me and said, "Negro." "Hell, those Negroes have got it even worse than we do," Tom said. "Edgar offered Hiawatha Jackson 50 cents a day to do some work, and Hiawatha took it. I don't know if I'm madder than that Edgar cut wages 'cause Hiawatha's colored, or that he didn't offer the job to me at the same price. Hiawatha and his wife Duty lived on Ella's farm and kept an eye on her." "Edgar Halbert's a cheap bastard," Grover said. Hiawatha was glad for anything. He told me his oldest boy's been all over the state looking for work, and that western Kansas is so dry you couldn't grow a bone there. He came home with dust pneumonia. I've heard some of the farmers out that way are packing up and headed for the Sahara Desert because it's got more water, Grover said. How are you holding up, Rita? Grover Grover meant did she want any more food, but Tom misunderstood and said she ought to take it easy. Little Agnes there doesn't let her sleep. Agnes, Grover said. You aren't going to name it Agnes, are you, Rita? I told Grover about the baby as soon as I'd gotten home. I'd rather eat goldfish. Agnes sure can get on your nerves, all right. Maybe we should have let her drown that time she fell in the creek. I told Tom to let her lie, Grover said. Oh, if I hadn't pulled her out, Floyd would have, and I'd have gotten a licking, Tom said. Why would Floyd do a thing like that, Grover asked. He was sweet on her, didn't you know? Floyd, I asked, looking at Grover. He was just as surprised as I was. Sure, but Agnes had her heart set on going to college. She wouldn't marry a farmer, and I guess that was just as well, Tom continued. If Floyd had married her instead of Ruby, Agnes would be an Okie now. Ruby and Floyd are not Okies, I said fiercely. Call 'em what you like. There are plenty of us who are 50 cents away from being Okies, Tom replied. We were all silent for a minute, thinking that over. Then Tom said, I was smelling the dirt in your east cornfield. I bet it's dry all the way down to China. It hasn't rained since we came here. We had a cloud last week, Grover said, but I think it was just an empty on its way back from Kentucky. This bourbon tastes like it came from there, too. Tom swallowed the last little bit in his glass. I sure miss the days when Rita and I spent Saturday nights drinking rye and playing cards. Your dad would have a fit if we did that here, Rita chuckled. Sometimes I feel just like that old lady in your club who lives off by herself without even electricity. What's her name again? Instead of answering, I got up and began to clear the table. Ella, isn't that it? Rita asked. I'd rather be lonesome than live with Ben Crook, I can tell you that, Grover said. Remember him, Tom? Before Tom could answer, I said, speaking of remembering, did you remember to save room for pie? I remember Queenie's pies all right, that's for sure, Tom said. I asked Rita to help me clear, and Tom and Grover started talking about the weather again. Rita and I took everything off the table and stacked it in the kitchen. Then I sent her back to the dining room while I got out the pie, stopping for just a minute to admire it, because it was the prettiest pie I'd ever made. The top crust was the palest shade of brown, sprinkled with sugar. A line of crimson oozed out of the vent I'd cut. I sliced it into 4 pieces, then whipped the cream and put it into a serving bowl with a big spoon and carried it all in. Tom gave me a big smile when I set his piece in front of him, and he told me even his mother's pies weren't as good as mine. I passed around the cream, and we all waited until everyone had spooned it out before we picked up our forks. As they cut their pie, the men discussed corn. Tom asked Grover how many bushels he figured he'd get from an acre, but instead of answering, Grover put up his finger to tell Tom to hold off a minute. He put a big bite of pie into his mouth before he said, The way I see it, he swallowed, stared at his pie a minute, then gave me a questioning look. Tom tried his pie and got the very same expression on his face. He didn't swallow. However, instead he pinched in his cheeks, keeping the pie in the middle of his mouth. Queenie, Tom said, moving the food in his mouth from side to side. What's wrong? What kind of pie is this anyway? Grover asked. Rhubarb, I said. Don't you know rhubarb pie? I thought it was your favorite. It doesn't taste like rhubarb, Tom said. He finally swallowed what was in his mouth and made a face. I picked it today on the north side of the barn, I said. Then I cut my own piece, but I couldn't bring myself to eat it. Rita tasted hers and spit it out onto her plate. Grover studied what was left of the pie, moving the crust aside, then picking at the filling. This is not rhubarb, Queenie. Grover grinned at me. It's Swiss chard. You made a rhubarb pie out of red Swiss chard. Swiss chard, Tom roared. No such a thing, I insisted, but Grover was right, and I turned as red as a chard while Grover laughed so hard he almost fell over backwards, which would have served him right, making fun of me like that. Tom tried to be polite and put his napkin over his mouth, but he sputtered behind it and shook his head while tears came into his eyes. Rita laughed too after she wiped the red off of her little white teeth. You're worse than me with the salt and vinegar. Even I know the difference between rhubarb and Swiss chard. Well, they look a lot alike. They're both red, and they have green leaves and stalks. There was no use explaining. Honey, you won't live this down for 100 years, Grover said when he caught his breath, and I knew he was right. I was so embarrassed that I was glad to gather up the plates and escape into the kitchen. The three of them were still laughing when I took in the plate of cookies I'd made that afternoon and served them for dessert instead. I left the dishes in the sink where I could do them the next morning, and after we'd eaten the cookies, I went out into the porch with the others. Grover poured out some more liquor, then said, I sure am glad I bought Tyrone's bourbon instead of this rhubarb wine. Tom and Rita laughed, but I gave Grover a poke, and he didn't say anything more. We sat there a long time, talking and laughing, and I could tell Tom and Rita didn't want to go. Before they left, we asked them to sign our guest book on account of it was Rita's first time in our house. Tom wrote, "Next time I'll take pie in the sky if you don't mind." As they started across the lawn, Rita called, "See you in the funny papers." Grover and I watched them walk down the road in the starlight. Once Tom turned back and sang, "KKK, Queenie, beautiful Queenie, you're the only BB bean that I adore." After a while his singing faded and was drowned out by the racket from the crickets. Then Tom and Rita disappeared into the night. Grover smelled for rain, and we both knew there wasn't any in the air. A coyote howled a long way off, and old Bob barked. Grover put his arm around me and said, "Time to hit the shucks," and we went inside. "You're pretty nearly the best friend Rita could have in Harveyville, even if she might not know it yet," Grover said, hooking the screen door and following me into the bedroom. I raised my eyebrow to ask what he meant, but in the dark he couldn't see the gesture. "I know Tom appreciates what you did." "Fixing dinner isn't so much trouble. I like doing it," I said, pushing up the bedroom window as far as it would go. The air was still hotter outside than in, but before morning there might be a breeze to cool us off, and I didn't want to miss it. You couldn't be a farmer without being an optimist about the weather. I stared into the night sky, but there were no clouds. "I don't mean inviting them for supper. I'm talking about your pie. That was a real nice thing to do, Queenie." Grover took off his clothes and sat down on the edge of the bed to wind the clock, even though he always woke up long before the alarm sounded. As he turned to read his watch in the moonlight, checking the time against the clock, the light coming through the window into the dark room caught the bald spot at the back of his head, making it gleam like a silver dollar. Grover reached over and set his watch on the bureau, got into bed, and held out his hand for me to come to him. Both Tom and I knew there isn't a farm girl alive who can't tell the difference between rhubarb and Swiss chard. The end of chapter 3. Y'all like